Hi, today I want to talk to you about some things to think about when you are designing a lino cut. Just a few ideas about design that might be helpful for improving the end result of your lino cut. So start with the basics. Should you give your lino cut a frame? Well, I don't often put frames around my work, but I've got a couple of examples to show you when I've done that. So this first one is actually a set of lino cuts. So these are each individual lino cuts that I've printed up as one, and they're little portraits. I did a public art job where I had to work in a factory, and this is kind of a portrait of the men that worked in the factory, or at least their hands as they are working. So here you can see very much I've gone for a frame. It's actually quite a heavy frame, and its job is to unify all the different prints and pull them together, and it gives a kind of formality to these pictures. And a frame will often do that. It'll give a kind of gravitas and a formality to your image. So if you have something like this, where you're tying them all together, in this instance, they're a picture of people working in an industrial setting, and actually having that kind of quite heavy frame works quite nicely with that, then a frame is great. If you are, on the other hand, like me, dealing with wild, empty landscapes, then maybe a frame isn't the best idea. But you can still get away with it. So here, I have a print of a wood here, and I haven't gone for a frame that goes all the way around. But you can see that I've been very careful to put birches at the edges here with these very stylized markings on the trunks of the trees, and it's just framing the print. You've still got space top and bottom, so a frame doesn't have to go all the way around, and it doesn't have to literally be a border. Sometimes it's nice to use a border to set up a rhythm with a set of prints. So in this instance, here, I've got a print from a series of 4 prints that I did, and these were Garden Seasons prints. So this is autumn, and I've got, again, quite a heavy dark frame around that. And all of the prints, they have different coloured backgrounds, but they all have a dark frame around them. So I can have a set where there are big differences between each print, but they all kind of lock together in the end. So a frame or a border can set up a rhythm for a set of prints. So it's quite handy from that point of view. So think about frames and think about whether you want that kind of boldness and sort of gravitas that a frame gives, or whether you just want things to just go away at the edges. The other thing that lino loves is a rhythm or a pattern. It kind of it strengthens the lino cut, the end result, and it sort of sets up a nice tension in the print. So let me show you a couple of examples. So here I've got a little print, which is a print that I did in Northumberland, and it's a little tiny croft there, and it's in these fields. And what I've done is to use these lines to sort of set up a rhythm through the landscape, and also repeating these hedges. They're not identical, but there's very much a repeat going on. And I find that really, really works. If you're really interested in that, have a look at Edward Borden's work. He is like master of the repeating pattern, but with variations. So that's how I've dealt with it there. I should also say, while I'm talking about this, here, this texture, this is something we'll look at in this series. This is done with wiping and layering, so we'll definitely look at that during the series. This one here is called High Summer, and what I wanted was to get that feeling of that sort of hot, blowy day near the coast that you sometimes get, And here there's a very definite rhythm to the clouds as they flow through the picture, to the tree as it's moving in the wind, and to the grasses in the foreground. And here you can see I've gone to the opposite of having a frame. I've actually got a lot of white space and no edge in the foreground. But the main thing that I want to show you about this picture is this feeling of sort of flow. So I've got flow going that way and then upwards as well. So it's again, it's a pattern and it's a repeat, but it's done in a different way to that croft and the three fields. Now, I don't really go in for the sort of more graphic side of lino anymore very often, but when I do, and I'll show you an example here, I like the playful aspect of lino. I think there's a sort of big argument for not taking lino too seriously. It responds to a kind of generosity and playfulness really well. So this is an illustration that I did for a certificate. When I send out prints to people, I put a certificate in, printed certificate to say it's an original print and not a giclée reproduction. So this is the illustration that goes on that. And I just had fun with it. And I think that's something to bear in mind. You can see how I've been really playing with texture and pattern. If you're going in for this kind of thing, always balance kind of areas of busyness with areas of quiet. You know, don't be afraid of those big black blocks in balance with all the pattern around it. And this kind of cutting can be really, really strong. There's a printmaker called Brian Angus who does a lot of pictures up in Scotland, harbour scenes and things like that. Have a look at his cutting. It's a really good example of that balance of pattern making and that sort of generous, almost playful feel to his print. So that's an example here. And again, look how I'm sort of balancing busyness with empty space there. So to go back to one of my more conventional prints, if you look at this one, which is called Gap in the Hill, it's quite a little print, but it's a great big landscape. So I haven't gone for a frame because I don't want to trap the landscape. I want to get the idea that you could just go walking for days in this and never get anywhere really. And so no frame, but I have got a kind of rhythm going here with the stones and that kind of repeating pattern. This again is another example of the wiping away technique that we will look at in this series. And you can see here this lines also setting up a kind of rhythm and flow that ties in with the lines at the back of the landscape. And I've also popped this little sheep on really as a sort of a joke. I quite like that sometimes, to just put something into the lino cut that's just a sort of little joke and an aside. But it's there for balance because everything's happening up this end. So we've got the waterfall and the all important gap in the hill. And if that sheep wasn't there, the image would still work. But just having that there to break the stronghold of this side of the print just gives it a little bit more balance. So it's thinking about stuff like this. Now, I'm going to talk a lot more about the specific design elements in the prints that I'm going to be using for this series, but really this film was just to give you some things to think about when you're designing a print, especially if you're new to lino cut. So I hope you found that useful, and I hope you'll join me for the next episode.